Hi, my name is Matia Simovich. I'm the founder of the band INHALT and of Infinite Power Studios, which is my recording studio here in Los Angeles. I'm a producer, I'm a musician, I'm an engineer, and I'm a sound designer. And as a sound designer, I've worked with various synthesizer companies, but my most enduring relationship has been with Sequential. And with Sequential, I've worked on all of their keyboards since the Prophet-12. I've made a lot of my sounds that ship with the factory banks. And my favorite synth that they've made is the Prophet-5 and the Prophet-10. And today I'm going to be showing you a very, very cool trick for the Prophet-5 and the 10 that gives us pulse width modulation that changes rate depending on where we are on the keyboard. So let's take a look. Before I get into the actual making of the patch, the first thing that I want to mention is why we're doing this in the first place. Most polyphonic analog synthesizers have a static LFO. What that basically means is if you take a look at the LFO section on the Prophet-5, there's a knob here, and that knob sets the rate. And that rate is fixed unless you manually move it. Now, most of the pulse width modulation sounds that we like have a profound amount of movement to them, and they tend to, at faster LFO rates, sound really good in the middle part of the keyboard and higher up. The problem is once you set this for this range of the keyboard, when you start playing lower notes, then the sound can get a little bit smeared. And that smearing on the bass end, we tend to register as a kind of severe detune. Now, that can be useful for an effect, but what we're looking for sometimes is a patch that's even. What that means is that we do have pulse width modulation on the bottom, but it's not as much as we have up top. And so with the up top notes and chords that we can play kind of in the mid and in the high section, we do want to capture all of that sweetness that pulse width modulation gives us. But on the bottom, we want the bass note to be not quite a fundamental, but clearly legible as what we're rooting it to, what the bass note is rooting, the part that we're playing. So the way to get around this is very difficult most of the time when you have a synthesizer that doesn't have voltage control over the LFO, which means if we don't have a mod matrix where we can assign something to change the speed of the LFO, then we have to resort to other methods. And the great thing about the Prophet-5 is in its simplicity is kind of its elegance, but that simplicity is actually, it's quite sophisticated in terms of what you can do. So it's very simple. The panel layout is very simple. The functions are very, very simple, but there's a lot within that simplicity that you can kind of play with. And so that brings us to this patch. So this patch is a pulse width modulation patch that uses oscillator B in LFO mode as opposed to using the standard stock LFO. So what we're going to do first is put the synthesizer into panel mode. And so I'm going to flip it out of preset. And now whatever the controls are on the panel is what the synth is doing. So we have this just panel mode. Since I'm going for a pulse width modulation sound that has some movement to it, it needs to also probably be something that's like a string patch. So I'm going to start building just a regular string patch. I'm going to make sure that oscillator A is up because that's going to be our main oscillator, and then oscillator B and the noise are down. And I'm going to make sure that the low frequency button on oscillator B is pressed in. Now, the most important part of this patch is the keyboard. Okay, so this needs to be enabled so that oscillator B, even though we're using it as a modulation oscillator, it is still going to follow the keyboard and change its rate depending on where we are on the keyboard. So it'll be slower on the bottom and faster up top. Next, I'm going to select the triangle wave here, and that has now set our oscillator B to be an LFO that chases the keyboard at a triangle wave. So now the frequency and the fine controls basically become our rate control for oscillator B. The next step, I'm going to disable some of this LFO stuff here. Again, check the mixer. I'm going to start playing with my amplifier envelope. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to give it some nice release. Great. I'm going to make sure that oscillator A is set to the square wave. And I'm going to put the pulse width at 50%. Now comes the important part. In the polymod section, we have 3 buttons: frequency A, pulse width A, and filter. We're going to select pulse width A. The source amount lets us choose whether or not we're sending the filter envelope or the oscillator B and how much. In this instance, we're going to be sending oscillator B to pulse width A. What that means is oscillator B is going to modulate the pulse width of the square wave in oscillator A. Fantastic. Classic pulse width modulation happening. Filter is a little bit dark, so now I'm going to play with the filter to open it up a little bit. Keyboard tracking, resonance. I'm going to play with the filter envelope. Okay, great. Now we have kind of this brassy, there's a brassy patch already happening. So the next thing to do is to figure out what the ideal frequency for oscillator B is going to be so that we're getting that warmth and that nice modulation in the middle and higher chords, but that we're still getting our bass solid. Great. Now I have faster pulse width modulation at the very top, kind of middle speed in the midsection, and the bass notes very slow. I'm still getting a little too much movement, so I'm going to attenuate how much of oscillator B we're sending to pulse width modulation for oscillator A. And while that sounds pretty good, we still can keep playing with it until we have a perfect blend of intelligibility in the bottom octave and warmth and movement in the mid and upper octaves. To me, that sounds excellent. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, but that only gives us a one oscillator patch, and that's correct. Even though it has this organic movement, it is still one oscillator. If you have a Prophet-10, though, there's a couple of things that you can do. One of them is the polyphonic unison mode. So basically, we still get 5-note polyphony, but we get 2 oscillators sounding at the same time and 2 oscillators acting as a modulator for a very, very organic pulse width modulation patch. So to get to that, we're going to enable unison. And while we're enabling unison, we're holding it. And we go to the option of PU2, so polyphonic unison 2. Now, we can also set, while we're holding the unison button, a detune. So I'm going to set it to 2 to create some unison detune and play this patch with that. And we can go even further with this train of thought by using the vintage mode. Currently, the vintage mode is set to 3, and because I'm using the Rev 3 filter, that's usually where I keep it. But we can bend it even more and set it at 12 o'clock, somewhere between 3 and 2. So now we have very, very slight differences voice to voice. And because we're actually using the oscillators very heavily in here in terms of the modulation, it's going to create all of these nonlinearities in the frequency, the speed at which oscillator B is creating the pulse width modulation effect for us. To add to this, we can even use the actual LFO, which we're not currently using, and we can use it for vibrato or kind of frequency modulation or modulating the filter. Here I'm going to give it some vibrato.